The 10 most dangerous countries in the world. There are many reasons as to why you should avoid these countries. Some of the factors that make these countries dangerous are their volatile governments, lack of stability, and political unrest. These countries also have high rates of crime and violence, which is one of the main reasons why you should avoid them. Venezuela.
Since 2013, Venezuela has been amidst its worst economic crisis to date. Since current President Nicolas Maduro has been at the helm, Venezuela's GDP has fallen by a staggering 40%, leaving Venezuelans with shortages of basic goods and skyrocketing rates of inflation. Venezuela averaged 17.3% inflation between 2008 and 2022, reaching an all-time high of 196% inflation in January 2019. Over 3 million people have fled Venezuela due to extreme poverty levels, crime waves, and widespread corruption that continues till today. It's clear these issues are far from resolved as this humanitarian disaster deepens each day. In November 2017, the second most bespoke economics brand, The Economist, estimated Venezuela's debt at $105 billion and its reserves at only $10 billion. The road to economic recovery is unclear as things continue looking rough for the country, just as
one of Venezuela's most infamous gangsters is behind bars after years on the run.
El Coqui became legendary in Caracas last year when his so-called mega gangs took on the police. Local 10's Cody Weddle has our one and only exclusive report.
Well, El Coqui had become a household name in Venezuela, especially after last year he was behind shootouts with authorities that forced hundreds of thousands of people to ensconce themselves in their homes for much of the day and night. Carlos Reverte, aka El Coqui, was the leader of what have become known as mega gangs in Caracas, an infamous figure that it appeared authorities would never catch. But early this afternoon, Interior Minister Remigio Ceballos confirming that in Tejerias, just outside of the capital, authorities had killed the legendary criminal.
Venezuela is a country in the northern part of South America. It is known for its natural resources, such as petroleum and natural gas. The Venezuelan economy has been struggling for years. Inflation rates are over 700%. The country has been in a state of recession since 2014, and it's expected to stay that way for some time. The Venezuelan crisis is one of the worst economic, social, and political crises in Latin America. The country's economy shrank by 34% in 2017. The country has been hit by hyperinflation and a shortage of basic goods such as food and medicines. The situation is so dire that the United States has imposed sanctions on Venezuela to pressure the government to change its policies. The country has been in a state of recession since 2014, and it's expected to stay that way for some time. Afghanistan. Afghanistan has a population of about 30 million people. It has been at war for most of its history. The country was occupied by the Soviet Union from 1979 to 1989, and then by the US and its allies from 2001 to 2014. In 2002, the Taliban ruled Afghanistan, and they were overthrown in late 2001 with help from NATO forces. The Afghan government is currently trying to implement reforms that will lead to economic growth and prosperity for all Afghans. The United States and NATO formally concluded their combat mission in Afghanistan on December 28, 2014, but the country remains politically unstable. Somalia.
Now that the Americans have withdrawn their troops from Somalia, how has Al-Shabaab responded to that news?
qofka bini'aadanka waxyaabo ku dabeecad oo leeyahay jirto qofka uu ka cabsanaya markuu ka tago oo iska dhacsiina inuu guulaysto maxaa yeelay sayar waxa waaye qofka ugu weyn oo membarka ugu dambeeya oo la dagaalamaya inay Ameerikaan yihiin haddii ay Ameerikaan ka guulaystaan inay wada guulaysteen haddii laga guuldareystaan ay guuldareysteen laakiin isma dhaxayaan haddii Ameerikaan oo dagaalka joojiyeen markaas jaarisyo badan dadka inay kusii xasuuqaan inay u suurtagelinayso.
Somalia is a country that has been through a lot of turmoil. In the last few years, the country's government has stabilized and is now looking to make progress in the coming years. The Somali pirates have been a problem for decades and have been responsible for countless attacks on ships and other vessels in Somali waters as well as around the globe. They have also kidnapped many people, including journalists, fishermen, and even tourists who were on vacation at popular destinations. Sudan.
On December 19, 2018, a revolution started to spread throughout Sudan. After decades of living under President Omar Bashir's brutal military regime, civilians pushed back. They wanted a democracy in their country. A few months later, this man and this man helped take down Bashir in a coup, and then promised protesters the future they had demanded. 4 years later, the same two men are now at war with each other, tearing Sudan apart, killing hundreds of civilians. So how did Sudan go from this to this in such a short time? And how did these two powerful men go from partners to enemies?
Sudan is a country located in northeastern Africa. Sudan is bordered by Egypt, Libya, Chad, and Central African Republic. The Sudanese civil war has been going on for decades, and it has led to thousands of deaths, displacement of millions of people, and destruction of the country's infrastructure. The Sudanese civil war began in 1955 when the southern part of Sudan wanted to break away from the country and form their own nation. The North wanted to keep it as one unified country. There were many attempts at peace talks, but they all failed due to disagreements between both sides on what should happen with the oil fields in the south. The last round of peace talks was held in 2014, but they too ended with no agreement reached. Iraq.
For this people trafficker, it looks like a routine transaction, but this is a police sting, with detectives posing as buyers. A hidden camera in the car captures the criminal, confirming that he's selling two women for $2,000 each. Once the deal is done, police arrest the trafficker and the women. Detectives say the women were part of the gang. They plan to run away from their buyer, then repeat their scam all over again.
The US invasion of Iraq was supposed to be easy. The most powerful military in world history would go in, kill the bad guys, and transform Iraq into a democratic, pro-American oasis. But the Iraq War blew up in America's face.
Stuff happens.
And it changed both countries. It changed the entire Middle East. In fact, it changed much of our world forever.
In this section, we will examine the Iraqi Civil War and the Iraq Crisis. The Iraq crisis began in 2003 with the invasion of Iraq by a coalition led by the United States. This invasion was made on the presumption that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction and was supporting terrorist organizations. The US-led coalition forces overthrew Saddam Hussein's government and occupied it for over 8 years. In 2011, US troops withdrew from Iraq, leaving behind a power vacuum. This vacuum was filled by ISIS in 2014, who then took control of large swathes of territory in Iraq. Libya.
These 53 men are accused of belonging to Islamic State, or ISIL. The armed group took control of Sirte in 2015, making the city its largest stronghold outside of Iraq and Syria. The men were taken prisoner in 2016 after government forces retook the city. They are accused of terrorist attacks and murder, including the beheading of 21 Egyptian Coptic Christians, as well as kidnapping and torture. After 15 court sessions, the judge delivered his verdict on a first group. 35 members sentenced to death. Others received prison sentences.
Throughout the course of our investigations, we have found obviously patterns of crimes against humanity, torture, forced disappearances, detention of migrants in particular. But the highlights of this report are enslavement, especially sexual slavery and forced labor.
Libya is a country in the northern African region. It borders the Mediterranean Sea to the west, Egypt to the east, and Tunisia to the north. Libya is known as the cradle of civilization because it was one of the first areas in Africa where people built cities and farming communities. In recent years, Libya has been subject to political turmoil and violence due to a civil war that began in 2011. The unrest has led some countries such as Canada, Australia, New Zealand, United Kingdom, and the United States of America to issue travel warnings for those looking to visit or live there. Syria.
Today marks 12 years since the beginning of the civil war in Syria. What began as civilian protests amid the Arab Spring uprisings of 2011, now by some estimates has killed at least 500,000 people, displaced millions more, and destabilized the region. Adding calamity on top of disaster, last month's earthquakes laid waste to land already pummeled by the regime of Bashar al-Assad and his Russian patron, Vladimir Putin.
Security forces have opened fire on protesters with reports of between 20 and 100 people dead.
The scenes are unprecedented, day after day of protest. Syrians now demanding what Tunisians and Egyptians have just won, and Libyans are currently fighting for: wholesale political reform. But Syria's President Bashar al-Assad is still a hero to many. And the pressure is mounting. Protests sprang up today just a few miles from the president's hometown. There is talk that Syria is fast reaching the point of no return.
The topic of Syria has been in the news for years and received a lot of attention this year. The country is currently at the center of the refugee crisis. The United States supports efforts to create a safe zone for civilians and refugees in Syria. This would be achieved by reducing fighting, bombing ISIS strongholds, and supporting political talks between Syrian President Bashar al-Assad's government and his opponents. Yemen.
Let's talk about peace in Yemen and why some people reckon it's closer than ever. Eight years of war have created one of the world's worst humanitarian disasters. 2/3 of Yemenis, 22 million people, rely on aid to survive. There have been several failed attempts to end the fighting, but the UN managed to broker a truce a year ago that's pretty much held up.
The war in Yemen is a few years shy of a decade. An internal conflict that intensified when Saudi Arabia invaded. Now the richest Gulf Arab country wants out of a war it started with some of the poorest in the world. Pro-Houthi Yemenis rallying in Sana'a are clear about the way forward.
They should leave Yemen alone. We will maintain our resistance against the occupation, against the stealing of Yemeni people's wealth, and against the removal of our decision-making and independence.
Dialogue in a UN-brokered truce enabled the longest period of relative calm in the 8-year-long war. But it lapsed in October, and after so much bloodshed, long-term peace seems out of reach.
We are ready to confront the Saudis by air, sea, and land. The next war will not be like the previous ones, because our military has developed and advanced.
Riyadh set out to reinstate a pro-Saudi Yemeni government as it switches focus to ambitious economic projects back home. In Yemen, tens of thousands of people have been killed, the economy is in ruins, and millions are being pushed closer to starvation every day.
Central African Republic.
The Chinese government has condemned the killing of 9 Chinese nationals at a mining site in the Central African Republic, where a civil war is raging, and the president of China, Xi Jinping, called on Monday for the perpetrators to be severely punished. The rebel coalition, initially blamed by some for the attack, put out a statement later in the day. Without providing evidence, it accused Russian mercenaries from the Wagner Group of being behind the violence. The attack early Sunday came just days after gunmen kidnapped 3 Chinese nationals in the country's west near the border with Cameroon. In 2020, 2 Chinese nationals died when local residents led an uprising against a Chinese-operated mine in Soso Nakombo. And in 2018, 3 Chinese citizens were killed by angry community members after a local leader died in a boating accident while accompanying Chinese miners to a site.
Central African Republic is a landlocked country in the center of Africa. It shares borders with 6 countries and has a population of 5.3 million people. This country was colonized by the French before gaining independence in 1960. But the Central African Republic experienced a genocide between 2013 and 2015, with an estimated 6,000 to 10,000 people still missing today. Democratic Republic of Congo.
The countryside of the northeastern Congo is beautiful, and the soil is rich and fertile, and yet the people here live in poverty and constant fear of attack by armed militias. Over 120 such groups have been operating for more than 2 decades on the territory of the Democratic Republic of the Congo along its northern borders to South Sudan, Uganda, and Rwanda. Neither the government nor tens of thousands of UN peacekeepers have been able to stop them, and the people's suffering inevitably leads to more suffering as victims join one rebel group or the other.
The Democratic Republic of Congo is a country has a long history of conflict and violence. This is reflected in the country's high rates of crime and corruption. The Democratic Republic of Congo is a country of great economic and cultural diversity. It has been the site of one of the worst humanitarian disasters in recent decades, with over 75% of its population living on less than $1.25 per day. Over the past 2 decades, over 5 million people have died as a result of violence and instability in this country, making it by far one of the most violent. There are many ways to fix this problem. One way is to increase the number of police officers in these countries. Another way is to provide more opportunities for people in these countries so they don't feel like they need to resort to crime or violence.